Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sparing Partners. And today we're going to talk about CBRS and its role in sharing, spectrum sharing, and also to provide a way for enterprises to have spectrum that they can use for their own applications. And I've been following CBRS for a long time, and this is sort of a good time to catch up on all of this because there are a lot of potential changes in the US from a regulatory point of view. And so I am here with Dave Wright, who is a spectrum policy analyst at Cellpoint Strategies. And I've known Dave for a very, very, very long time. But most recently, through his work, he was the president of the ONGO Alliance, which used to be the CBRS Alliance at some point earlier than that. And then he moved to HPE, where he was working also on wireless policy. And so Dave knows everything about CBRS and is now working from an independent point of view. So that's even better because we will get to hear what he thinks about it. So I look very much forward to our discussion today. So Dave, welcome to Sparing Partners.
Thanks, Monica. It has been a while, and I am really glad to reconnect and look forward to the conversation. And as you said, I'm a spectrum policy analyst with Saltpoint. I also serve as the policy director with an organization called Spectrum for the Future, which advocates for dynamic spectrum sharing and other spectrum paradigms that make spectrum available for localized and private cellular use cases. So yeah, really looking forward to the discussion. I don't know that I know everything about CBRS, but I'll do my best.
I said that. You're not responsible for it.
Okay, good.
Okay, so actually, just quick clarification. When we're talking about dynamic spectrum sharing here, it's something different from Wi-Fi because Wi-Fi, everybody can use the spectrum. Dynamic spectrum sharing. Can you just give a very quick description to what that is for?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, people say shared spectrum or spectrum sharing, and I always, as if it was something new, and I always highlight that, shared spectrum has been around forever with Wi-Fi and unlicensed spectrum being the best example, because in Wi-Fi and with unlicensed spectrum, you don't have exclusive use. You coexist with others, and in that framework, essentially use some sort of listen before talk or interference mitigation mechanisms to optimize the use of the spectrum while there are no protections against interference, right? Which is a very essentially what's the word I'm looking for? Orthogonal or diametrically opposed to exclusive license spectrum, where one entity has access to spectrum at a location and nobody else can use it there, right? So yes, unlicensed is shared. Dynamic spectrum sharing, which is really what CBRS is about, introduces the idea of essentially geolocation awareness as well as database coordination, right? So there are cloud-based systems, databases that manage access to spectrum in near real time. So that's the dynamic aspect of it. And the geolocation bit is that the radios in one of these dynamic spectrum sharing frameworks will be aware of where they are. They will have location awareness. And so, they communicate just using a regular, TCP IP based protocol interface. They communicate with these cloud database spectrum management systems. Say, the radio says, I'm at this location. I would like to operate in this dynamic spectrum band, and I need a grant of X amount of spectrum, 10 megahertz, let's say, in a CBRS context. The spectrum management system database has awareness of all of the other operations, both incumbents, other users at that tier. So in the CBRS context, other CBRS users in the area, and then we'll make a grant of spectrum back to the radio. So to my mind, it's very much analogous to the transition we had, in the 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, from like static IP addresses, right? So I was a network administrator in, yeah, like 93, 94 timeframe. And I used to have a spreadsheet of every IP address I assigned to every workstation, and you would go and you would say, here's your IP address, here's your mask, here's your gateway, blah, blah, blah. And you had to do that on a station by station basis, right? That's how we managed it. And then somebody came up with DHCP, and all of a sudden, when a station came up, it asked for an IP address. DHCP server gave it an IP address, off you go. We're going to move into that world. And I would say that I think that static allocation of spectrum and static management of spectrum, at least in the low and the mid bands, has probably gotten us about as far as we're going to get. And so I think introducing more dynamic management of the spectrum as a resource is going to be critical going forward, because there just isn't any more greenfield spectrum. And so these DSS systems, dynamic spectrum sharing systems, really hold a lot of promise for just maximizing the efficiency, because you can support multiple services within the same frequency range with incumbents, new entrants, different tiers of service. CBRS is great because we were doing all sorts of stuff there, everything from mobile services, traditional cellular mobile service, to fixed wireless access, to private, to IoT, neutral host, all sorts of stuff. And you can do all of that within the same band.
No, absolutely. And yeah, I think it's, dynamic spectrum sharing. It's a great idea, especially, the higher the frequency, the more compelling it becomes. If I just have to make a sort of very broad generalization, but and we've been talking about that for a very long time. But initially, it was just so complicated. We just didn't have. I guess it's just like the fixed and IP address. Like at the beginning, just we couldn't do otherwise. I mean, we had the idea conceptually, it was appealing. In practice, it was not feasible, and now it is feasible and it's working. CBRS has showed that it is
Yeah,
working. And in the case of CBRS in the US, that allowed us to use a band that otherwise would be off limits because of the military uses of it. So
right.
there is huge, I think that nobody would disagree on that. However, or is it?
No, no, I was going to agree with you. I was going to say, I think that, CBRS is, we used to call it an experiment because, as you said, this was one of the first, attempts. Yeah, there's TV white spaces and a few other things that preceded it, but, for a variety of reasons that never really got to, mass scale like we have with CBRS. And so, people used to refer to CBRS as an experiment. And I think that was fine in the 2019, 2020 timeframe. But now we've shown, this works. We've been doing it for 5 years. We've got 420,000 base station radios operating in the band. We've had, zero reports of interference to the incumbent military systems that operate in the band. So, it's not an experiment anymore. It's a proven real world thing that's providing critical services to a variety of sectors.
Yeah, but you're right. At the very beginning, there was a question like, is it really going to work? Is it going to break everything down? There was that kind of,
Mm-hmm.
which was reasonable because nobody had tried before on a sort of commercial scale. So it wasn't completely,
That was
fine.
fine. Yeah, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it's fine. But we're past that is my point. And
yeah,
and and on the matter of scale, one of the things that I find encouraging, I know we're going to talk mostly about CBRS, but in the dynamic spectrum sharing context, one of the things that I'm encouraged by just looking at wireless and the industry very broadly is that on the unlicensed side, and this is also where I want to kind of go back to your relationship between unlicensed and dynamic spectrum sharing. I would say, again, unlicensed writ large is shared spectrum. 6 gigahertz, and particularly the standard power version or standard power mode of 6 gigahertz unlicensed, introduces dynamic spectrum sharing because there's a new database component called the Automated Frequency Coordination Entity, AFC, which essentially is this, cloud system which coordinates the spectrum access for 6 gigahertz standard power, which is essentially outdoor and higher power. And they have to operate around incumbent microwave radios in the 6 gigahertz band. So the thing that excites me about 6 gigahertz standard power and AFC is it will take DSS global. So CBRS has been great. It's proven DSS in the US, but it's been a US specific thing. Whereas 6 gigahertz AFC is already happening in the US and Canada, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, a number of other countries are following suit. So I think it'll really make DSS a thing at a global scale.
No, absolutely. I think this is important because you say CBRS is really US thing, but it doesn't detract any of the importance in sort of proving the case that
Yeah.
so while we all agree that it's a good thing, well, pretty much, how to actually go about it, there's been a lot of discussion from the early days, and now it's continuing because on one hand, there is the desire to make it a little bit simpler and to increase coverage, which is something we've kind of been working on. And now lately there is again the issue about should it become sort of less shared in a sense because we just moved to a different, so there have been proposals to move to a different framework, which would introduce licensed use for the band or higher power levels. And so the question is, how should we go about it? So this is kind of a really broad question. So maybe we should kind of break it down, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what is the thing about licensed versus shared. What's the balance there? And how is that changing?
I want to make sure I understand your question completely.
Mhm.
So are you talking about traditional full power exclusive license at sort of a large geographic level? So, call it macro
Yeah.
mobile operator spectrum
So just
versus,
yeah, the sort of his story about the sort of in short terms, what how did we get to what we are today, and where are we going next?
okay. Well, okay, so I'm just gonna go up to like
Mhm.
200,000 foot.
Yeah,
We're now
exactly.
in like, we're not even maybe we're in geosync orbit. We're high up. Is where I'll start. And I'll just say I have a try to have a very comprehensive view of terrestrial spectrum. I don't necessarily think a lot about satellite spectrum. It's just not my thing. But looking at terrestrial uses of spectrum commercially, I think it's critical that we have a sufficient amount of spectrum for traditional cellular macro networks operated by typically national mobile operators who provide coverage across the country. And gotta have it, part of our everyday life. We need to have sufficient store of unlicensed spectrum because 90% of data traffic is carried by unlicensed. We're doing this Zoom call. Probably I'm doing it over Wi-Fi. I'm assuming you're doing it over Wi-Fi. It's how I consume most everything. All the devices here in my house are Wi-Fi connected. So unlicensed spectrum, yeah, has a definite need for spectrum, and that will increase going forward as data use increases. And then and those two access frameworks of traditional licensed and unlicensed have been around for 30-ish years. License predates unlicensed, but they've both been around for 3 decades or more. This new paradigm with dynamic spectrum sharing, CBRS, even 6 gigahertz AFC, those are new. Those have only been, we've been talking about them for 15-ish years, but they've only been in operation now for 5 years, really, with CBRS. So, those are new, but they're really proving their value. One of the things that they're really enabling quite well is private deployments of cellular technology. So private 5G, private LTE. We'd love to talk more about what we've done in that context with CBRS. And other countries are supporting private LTE and private 5G. They're doing it in a little different way. They're not doing dynamic spectrum sharing, at least not yet. But they've made local licenses available for enterprises and industrial players, logistics hubs, et cetera. So you've got, big private LTE and private 5G deployments in the UK and Germany, the Netherlands, like Port of Rotterdam, Brazil, China, South Korea. So this is a growing thing, and so spectrum that supports those, alternative cellular use cases, I'm going to call them. Yeah, that's important too. So when you ask me, what's the balance or what's the ratio, I would hesitate to give you it's 40, 40, 20. Yeah. I would hesitate to give you a specific figure other than to say, I think we really need to look at where the demand is. Unfortunately, as a policy analyst, I what I see happening sometime is that regulators and policymakers will sort of put their hands on the scale of that balance, and they tend to favor traditional exclusive use, high power licensed spectrum for the simple reason that it is sold at an auction typically, and those auctions tend to generate significant amounts of revenue, upwards of $80 billion for the C-band licenses here in the US, for instance, and to the extent that those revenues can be used to pay for other government programs or offset, national debt or pay down deficits, things like that, policymakers, tend to think that that's great. And I can understand why they would. However, I think when you look at like the overall economic contribution from a wireless technology and the spectrum that underpins it, you can see that, with Wi-Fi contributing, hundreds of billions and even trillions of dollars in GDP contribution in countries like the US, we probably don't want to just think about spectrum policy based on an auction revenue.
No, absolutely. Yeah, as I said, that licenses are easier to track. You know how much money you're getting. It feels good to get money. And on the other hand, there's clearly a huge financial advantage of Wi-Fi. But whenever you see somebody trying to actually estimate it, it's very, very hard. I would say it's impossible to really be accurate because how do you know? It's a very indirect. Uh,
I agree, and
so
I'm not an economist. I mean,
no, no,
there,
yeah.
what Wi-Fi Alliance has done some really good studies. I'm thinking of Earl Katz from who's done a lot of work around this. But as you say, it's consumer surplus and concepts around if you didn't have Wi-Fi, how much would you be spending to do these things over, some type of other connection and things like this? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really hard, and then you can see why people then argue back and forth. Yes, so a lot of people have tried and they've done very good work, but I think it's really intractable in the sense of you cannot track it with the same accuracy that you track license revenues. That's completely different.
License
Kind
revenues are very easy to
Yeah,
assess, as you say, but that's just like one small component of the overall economic, value
yeah.
of a spectrum band, unfortunately.
But so regulators have a bias, but operators have even a stronger bias, obviously, because they would like to have everything licensed. So with CBRS, they've been arguing from the beginning that this should be basically licensed spectrum. But then they kind of tolerated the enterprise, but now they're trying to be even, more like we need to have higher power. So how is that? How did it play out in CBRS?
Yeah, I'd say there's two different things you kind of touched on there, Monica. So, you know, okay, so I'll talk about licensing in the context of CBRS, and your most of your viewers are probably familiar with CBRS at a certain level, but if for anybody who's not, one of the things that's cool about CBRS is we have three tiers of access. We protect the incumbent operations; they sort of have the first rights to the band. And then we've introduced two new tiers of service. One is got essentially a protected right. It's and we sold licenses to these protected rights to spectrum access. It's not a specific block. We can't do that in CBRS because it's dynamic and we have to protect incumbents and not move around them. But what it essentially assures you a 10 megahertz spectrum, block access, dynamic block, if you will, for a geographic coverage area, which in this case was county level. And so you are the exclusive user of that 10 megahertz in that county if you bought the license, and that was an auction that was conducted in 2021, if I remember correctly, and we raised over $4 billion and sold 32,000 licenses, if I remember correctly, 228 different entities secured licenses. So it was like the largest auction the FCC has ever conducted in terms of how many different entities participated, and in terms of the licenses that were awarded. And the reason it was so large in terms of the participation was because CBRS supports all the different things that I was talking about. You had all sorts of entities acquiring licenses and bidding, everybody from Verizon mobile operator to Charter and Comcast, big cable operators, to Dish networks, to lots of wireless internet service providers in rural areas securing licenses to provide service to their entities, to power companies and enterprises, and even schools and universities. So that all happened at what we call the priority access tier, and you'll hear the licenses called PALs, or priority access licenses. So again, if you have a PAL license, that gives you protected rights to 10 megahertz for a county, and that means you went through the auction process. The third tier is called general authorized access, or GAA, and essentially, if spectrum's not being used by an incumbent, or it's not being used by a PAL license holder, it becomes available for GAA use. And people say it's like unlicensed, and okay, maybe to a certain degree. I think it's better to say it's opportunistic, because it's actually licensed by rule is the technical term for it, according to how the regulations are written. But again, any spectrum in this 150 megahertz, CBRS is 150 megahertz wide, any spectrum at a location not being used by the military or the PAL license holders is available for GAA use opportunistically. And what we've seen in the 5+ years, coming up on 6 years that CBRS has been in service, is that the vast majority of the utilization of the spectrum is happening at that GAA opportunistic tier, which doesn't surprise me. It's there's essentially not zero cost, there's very low cost to spectrum access at the GAA tier. You have to have an arrangement with one of the database providers. We call them spectrum access systems, or SASs, in CBRS. So obviously you have to have a relationship with them, because it's through them that you get access to the spectrum. But aside from that, there's no cost. You don't have to pay for a license. You just say, hey, I'm here, I'm a GAA user, I need 20 megahertz. Boom, off you go.
And that's inside. Yeah.
So that was
I agree.
licensing. Sorry. Yeah. So CBRS does contain a licensing component at the PAL tier. So I just want to make that clear. So there have been some people saying we need to look at the 3 gigahertz band, and it doesn't make sense that we've got this lower power CBRS dynamic sharing band in the middle of a very high power exclusive use traditional license band at C band, which is 3.7 to 3.98, and CBRS it's at 355 to 37. And then just below CBRS, you have the 3.45 band, or it's basically 3.45 to 3.55. And that again is another very high power, traditionally licensed, macro cellular band. So people are like, hey, why do we have CBRS here? Maybe we should move CBRS like down into the lower 3 gigahertz, below 3.45, excuse me, and just make all of this, high power, exclusive use. Life will be great. Like, no. Well, some recent legislation just got passed. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act was signed into law in early July, and it has a lot of spectrum provisions, but calling on restoring the FCC's auction authority for one thing, and then requiring a certain amount of spectrum to be made available for full power commercial services and auction to generate, again, to generate revenues for Treasury. But very importantly, some members of Congress put in provisions protecting the 3.1 to 3.45 military band from the introduction of commercial services. So, it looks like attempts to move CBRS into lower 3 gigahertz are now off the table, given the language in the legislation. So I don't think we have to worry about that anymore. The second part of the question, I believe you originally asked, was around higher power in CBRS, and that is still, potentially in play. The FCC had a rulemaking, further notice of proposed rulemaking back in the fall of last year, so almost a year ago now, and really the purpose of that FNPRM was largely to put into statute or to codify some changes that had been agreed to in CBRS. And these were changes that industry and the FCC and NTIA, which is the federal spectrum regulator in the US, and the DoD had all agreed to. So what we did is we basically said, hey, we've been doing this for 5 years. Can we go back and look at some of the protection requirements, particularly the protection requirements for the military incumbent systems, because we think we're probably being a little conservative. And indeed, that was the bottom line, is everybody agreed, yeah, we can relax some of these requirements because we haven't had any interference to the military. And if we make some of these changes, we're going to dramatically improve the commercial operations in the band, extend the areas where we can operate, limit the impacts when there is a federal preemption event, when we need to move people in the band to protect the military. We can reduce the areas of impact. So that was all done collaboratively. One of the great things about CBRS is the collaboration that's gone on between the industry and all these federal entities. And so that work was done, gosh, like 2 years, a year and a half ago. And we call it CBRS 2.0, or those changes. So, sorry, the FCC wants to sort of take those changes as well as clean up some stuff that was in the original report and order, having to do with other grandfathered incumbents like Part 90 operators, and that is all gone away. So it's time to kind of update the rules, introduce the CBRS 2.0 changes. So that's largely what the FNPRM is about, and that's all great. That needs to happen. But there was a question that was raised because, throughout the history of the band, even even before the original, RNO authorizing the service was issued back in 2019 timeframe, there were calls for people saying, hey, we want this to be a higher power band. And so because there had been things on the record about, should you think about higher power operations in CBRS, the FCC did ask a question about higher power in the FNPRM. And sure enough, they got a lot of feedback on that issue, as you can imagine. They haven't ruled on this yet. At some point, I would expect they would, particularly on again, the kind of the mundane things, the cleanup and the CBRS 2.0 enhancements. Yeah, I mean, I personally think that the commission set out to make this a lower power small cell band. It was always envisioned for that. It was never envisioned as just another macro cellular band. And I would also say that, the work on CBRS goes back to the 2012 timeframe, with the original authorizations of CBRS and services in the band in 2019, and then full commercial deployments in January of 2020. So, CBRS actually predates both the high power C band and the high power, 3.45 band that have moved in on either side. But they came in after us. We were the first in the neighborhood. So, if they want to adapt to our rules, I think that'd be great. But, again, we were always a lower power localized band supporting a variety of services. And that was the commission's intent from the get-go. They wanted, it was been referred to as the innovation band. And you know what? There's been a hell of a lot of innovation in the band. We've got people using this for seismic sensors in Florida to know when sinkholes are opening up in oil field, or not oil fields, but in, I forget exactly what what is. I know they're using seismic sensors to look for sinkholes in Florida. I'm just trying to remember the particular company that's doing that. Oil and gas industry in Texas actually is using this to monitor pipelines. Sempra Energy. The Marine Corps, my old employer from a long time ago, is using this. They've got the largest 5G automated smart warehouse within the DoD at the Marine Corps Logistics Base in Albany, Georgia, and it's all done with CBRS. John Deere, um, they've got, I think it's 50,000 square foot of manufacturing that they've done in a reconfigurable Industry 4.0 type way, manner. And I was actually just looking at this, and I will give you a number here as soon as I find it. So they said, here we go. Yeah, so 50 acres, pardon me. So covering 50 acres under one roof, John Deere is standardizing on an 80-10-10 mix of coverage for this, smart factory where they manufacture their equipment. 80% is private 5G over CBRS, 10% is Wi-Fi, and 10% is wired Ethernet. The innovation that's going on with CBRS and private LTE and private 5G, that has all happened because it's a lower power localized deployment band. If you were, and when I say low power, just so everybody knows, so in CBRS, you have two categories of radios, what are called Category A or Category B. Category A is up to 30 dBm per 10 megahertz, so about 1 watt of radiated power. And then 47 dBm is Category B. Category A is indoor only or outdoor below 6 meters. If you go outdoors, or anything above 1 watt outdoors, or you go above 6 meters, then it's Category B, and that can be up to 47 dBm per 10 megahertz, which is about 50 watts per 10 megahertz. So that's enough for some metro area coverage. Gives some really good coverage actually, in like for WISPs with their point-to-point systems. They can go pretty good clip with 47 dBm 50 watt radios. But you're not going to provide national coverage with this because again, it was never intended for that. And what's more important is that you can get more radios into the same geographic area because it's lower power, right? And particularly with like the Cat A indoor stuff, with building entry losses and everything else, that's why we have 420,000 radios deployed in the band, and that's why you can pack a whole lot of CBRS into like a metro area because we're operating at lower power. When people start talking about 60 dBm, 72 dBm type stuff, now you're into that's the kind of power that your cellular tower along the interstate operates at. You're talking thousands of watts of power, and that's great if you're trying to cover hundreds of not hundreds, but well, square miles, hundreds of square miles at a clip. but it doesn't do much for densifying the network. And one of the things that I just think is somewhat ironic is that, as the mobile industry keeps talking about needing additional capacity, right? It's not just about coverage now, it's about capacity. 5G is all about, having 80 megahertz or 100 megahertz wide carriers, or what they call carriers, which we would call channels. And it's like, well, yeah, yay, good. That's great. But the way you really get capacity in a network is by densifying it, right? Instead of having one base station, I want to have two or four or eight. And that's been the whole trend in Wi-Fi, by the way, over the last 30 years, as we've gone from 2.4 gigahertz to 5 to 6, and we're getting smaller coverage zones because then I can put more base stations, provide more capacity, in the overall geographic area. So, yeah, the mobile industry has said they're going to densify. They know they need to densify to add capacity, but the unfortunate economics of the mobile industry right now don't really support the CapEx to do that. They would have to spend a lot of money to build out new base stations. Again, where you had one, you would need, two, three, five, whatever, and the backhaul and da da
Yeah,
da.
so I think that, there is this kind of conception in the industry traditionally, right? The more power, the better off you are. But, I think that, as you say, this is actually not true, because if you want to have spectrum to use, you actually need to have lower power. That's why in Wi-Fi, the spectrum usage is so much higher, and clearly that doesn't work for you don't want to make every band to be unlicensed and low power, because
No,
you're doing different things. But you
yeah,
do need, so
yeah,
I think
yeah.
that even from the mobile operator point of view, I'm not really so sure that they would benefit all that much, because they already have the high power spectrum. So
Right.
even from their point of view, I think that there is an advantage of having some spectrum where it's lower power and higher density of um, infrastructure, which means more reuse. It's just like, it's just not. I think that this is kind of a legacy mindset
Mhm. I agree
that
with you.
it just no longer holds.
I fully agree with you. And again, as we are now solidly in the 5G era, transitioning quickly into the 6G era, I know that some regulators I have talked with are really they're wrestling with how do we get the mobile industry to kind of move past these legacy mindsets of, high power exclusive use to more of a, lower power, call it medium power or something.
Mhm.
But lower power and shared use kind of a paradigm, because that's what is going to be necessary in a 6G type of time frame, or excuse me, 6G type of an environment where you're wanting to carry, gigabits of traffic. That's simply not possible when I've got one base station trying to cover, again,
Yeah,
tens of miles, because, I've got multiple stations. They're all going to be wanting to do whatever that's consuming all this bandwidth. It's not possible. So I need more base stations to provide that capacity.
absolutely. Our time is up, but I think you proved yourself that you actually do know everything about CBRS. So it was great talking to you and get an update of what's the latest, because I think everybody, not just in the US, but everybody worldwide, is looking at, what's going on there. And it looks like we are on track with a lot of interesting stuff going on. So, David, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you, Monica. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you all for listening in. I hope you enjoyed it. And if so, do subscribe to the feed if you haven't done so, and let other people know. Thank you so much.